According to maritime intelligence, and this is the firm Kepler, Indian refiners accounting for over half of the country's Russian oil imports are preparing to comply with the latest US sanctions. Top importer Reliance Industries, which has a long-term deal with Rosneft, will stop taking Russian oil. Two other refiners, Mangalore Refinery and Petrochemicals Limited and HPCL-Mittal Energy Limited, a joint venture between Lakshmi Mittal's Mittal Energy and the HPCL, have also announced plans to suspend their imports. Together, these three refiners accounted for more than half of India's 1.8 million barrels per day of Russian crude imports in the first half of 2025. And in contrast, Nayara Energy's Vadinar Refinery, partly owned by Rosneft and already under EU sanctions, is likely to maintain its current intake of Russian oil. Now, Kepler's lead research analyst, Sumit Retolia, said that Russia remained India's top crude supplier in October, followed by Iraq and Saudi Arabia, but refiners began scaling down after 21st of October to avoid exposure to US sanctions. He's also added that Russian arrivals will sharply decline in December before gradually recovering through early 2026 as traders turn to intermediaries and alternative routes. And to make up for reduced Russian inflows, Indian refiners are ramping up purchases from the Middle East, Latin America, West Africa, Canada, and of course the United States. US crude shipments to India jumped to 5.68 lakh barrels per day in October, the highest since March 2021, though analysts expect flows to normalize by early next year. However, higher freight costs and limited arbitrage opportunities could restrict how much India substitutes from distant suppliers. In short, Indian refiners are now diversifying their oil basket, with new inflows expected from Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Guyana, and West Africa as Russia's direct share begins to narrow. My colleague Karthik Malhotra joins us from the newsroom here. Karthik, what does this essentially imply? What kind of substitutes are we looking at? And when the analysts from the firm say that this is all going to start normalizing early 2026, what do they essentially mean?
Right, Kabir. So I think, the writing was on the wall pretty much when these two Russian firms, Rosneft and Lukoil, were sanctioned by the United States. And there was pressure on India in any case to stop purchasing Russian oil because the US had all this while been saying that India is indeed funding Russia's war in Ukraine by purchase of Russian crude, which then gets processed in India before getting sold in multiple markets, including EU as well as many other parts of the world. So I think what this essentially means is that those sanctions are now really playing out as the Trump administration expected them to play out, and India is going to reduce its own import of Russian oil. Now, does this mean that there's going to be a deficit of crude entering India? Absolutely not. If you remember, the clarification that came even from the Foreign Affairs Ministry was pretty clear that India is open to diversifying its sources of procuring crude, and that is exactly what is playing out right now. So it means that India is going to continue balancing its need for import of crude oil, which is essential to fuel India's own energy needs, as well as cater to its clients outside the shores of India, especially when it comes to the private sector. But overall, there seems to be absolutely no shortage of suppliers on the global scene, and that is evident in the fact that oil prices have maintained their levels, and we are looking at crude at about $60 or so a barrel. So as such, there is no real shocker to the global economy or to India's own oil import needs by stopping purchasing Russian oil.
Right.
Also, if you remember, the deep discounts which were offered to India by Russia, those days have been long over. So in any case, India wasn't really getting a strong economic advantage by continuing importing oil from Russia.
And Karthik, two more things. First and foremost, on the left side of the Libra scale, you have the bonhomie between India and Russia. Real long-time strategic partners, Lavrov and Jaishankar. The counterparts, they share their kind of strategic bonhomie as well. And on the other side, we're now learning that we're going to now look at other alternatives like Guyana, West Africa, the Middle East. What does this mean in terms of the freight charges? Will the people now have to shell out extra from their own pocket? And on the other side, you have the Russia-India ties, which seem to be, it has, tested all sorts of various geopolitical developments. What's going to happen on that front? And will people have to now shell out extra because of,
Right.
freight charges?
So as I see things right now, India is playing the tough balancing act at one level, wanting to be in the good books of Donald Trump, despite not really giving in too much as far as negotiations over that trade agreement with US go. At the same time, our sort of camaraderie and our business interests also happen to be aligned with Russia. So let me answer your later part of the question first. In terms of our customers going to shell out more money, absolutely not, because crude prices, like I mentioned, are stable across the board. And if one source of crude dries up or is sanctioned, you have multiple other players who are willing to jump into the fray, and that obviously is a resultant of the fact that you don't have crude price going through the roof. You don't have those spikes visible right now, which means that even minus Russia, there isn't really too much of a supply side constraint, because even OPEC has not literally decided yet to increase its oil supply. That means there is enough oil supply in the world. So directly, it's not really going to matter to the Indian consumer or to Indian refiners, because the days of deep Russian oil discounts are also long over. But I think the balancing act that India has to do with its historic as well as the proposed long-term interests in the region as well as with Russia, that is something which is going to more than get offset by other ways. Remember, even pre-pandemic, even pre the Russia-Ukraine conflict, India wasn't buying as much oil from Russia as it started to buy simply to protect its own economic interests, because we were getting those deep discounts. So now that that side of the trade equation has played its story out, now you have the other side, because India is also, if you remember, in talks to build those Sukhoi SJ-100 aircraft in India, for which there's going to be technology transfer, and HCL is going to build them. So I mean, right now, legally, given the sanctions on these two oil firms, you don't really have a case to legally procure oil. See, Nayara Energy, because it is partly owned by Rosneft, is a different story, because Rosneft, does not have to transact with Nayara. So it can continue to supply without any monetary consideration, because it is partly owned by Rosneft. But for the case of Reliance and for other countries where a financial transaction has to go through, that in a sanctions environment, in any case, is legally untenable.
All right. Many thanks, Karthik, for joining us here.